Representation is really important in media and film. Everyone seems to be pushing for more diverse representation, but all representation isn't good representation. The suggestion is that if we see more representation, it will create more empathy for different groups of people, and more people will be able to see themselves in different walks of life. This is good and amiable, but what cultivation theory suggests as it relates to media effects theory is that if negative images are represented in the media, it will cultivate equally negative perceptions of the depicted peoples or ideas. So today, we're looking at Black people, the focal point of diversity and representation efforts in the United States, and reviewing everything wrong with Black representation in the media as a means of identifying some of those negative ideas and images that produce a bad flavor regarding certain characters or create negative feelings about this group of people, and to understand generally why some television and film might be problematic. First, let's talk about the most obvious bad representation, the one where Black people don't exist. Having a lack of representation is bad representation because it gives the illusion that Black people don't matter or that we're irrelevant. There is a reason why many Eastern countries still view the United States as if everyone here is white, because Hollywood got away for so many decades with not putting people of color in film, when we represent a large segment of the population, floating the racist idea that Black people wouldn't sell. I never realized how egregious this lack of representation was until I started traveling to places like New York. Shows like Friends and Sex and the City had so few Black people in their fake New York that it makes the real New York look like Zimbabwe. Not to mention the dozens of other ethnicities of people that live there. Now, speaking of racism, there are some forms of representation that are problematic or wrong, but some other forms that are historically racist. We're going to take some time now to review some of the more overtly racist types of depictions. Blackface. Although not traditionally performed by Black people, blackface depictions are racist and present warped caricatures of Black features and culture. Jezebel. This is a sexually promiscuous and worldly woman that contrasts the demure respectability of white womanhood historically. The Sapphire. A woman who is loud and domineering. She takes the role of her husband and usually drives the husband or man in her life, the father of her children, away. This stereotype evolved into the angry Black woman stereotype. Sambo. This term refers to a couple of slurs and stereotypes that represent Black people as lazy, happy, laughing, ignorant, and irresponsible. The tragic mulatto. This refers usually to a character that is a beautiful, light-skinned Black woman of mixed descent who tries to escape their Blackness by marrying a white man or gaining some type of white acceptance that will validate her Blackness. And although this depiction is racist in its need to validate Blackness, it does at least have a historical relevance, as Black persons of ambiguous visage or heritage could be enslaved if they were found out to be mulatto or quadroons during the slave era, or lose their status in society completely during the Jim Crow era of American history. Mandingo. This was a sexually voracious Black male with a stereotypically large penis. It is a common misconception that this stereotype benefits Black men, but it actually doesn't, as it promotes the idea that Black men are instinctually primitive and animal-like. Uncle Tom. A man who is single-mindedly focused on the prosperity of white people over Blacks. They're compliant and usually critical of Black people. Mammy. The mammy is the female counterpart to the Uncle Tom. She is a Black woman who takes care of a white family and their children with much affection and is usually beloved by the family. She's fiercely dedicated, and although she has an ideal, dominant, important role within that family structure, she doesn't have any outside interests or desires. Generally, these historical depictions of racism in media don't find themselves into modern programming. So here are some modern black racist stereotypes. Food. So this one is technically over 100 years old at this point, but still finds its way into modern depictions. Chicken and watermelon being highly associated with black food stereotypes. Drug addicts. Many black characters are often associated with or are drug addicts themselves in cinema and television. Gangsters. Modern black depictions also overrepresent black people as members of gangs or criminals, suggesting an overall dangerousness of black people. The welfare queen. This is a black woman who lives off the state, doesn't work, and has a bunch of children. She usually lives in squalor. The angry black woman. The angry black woman is a loud, angry, obnoxious woman who is verbally abusive and demanding. This is an evolution of the sapphire stereotype. Athleticism. Black people are overrepresented as athletic, which in some ways plays into the primitive traits or skills of the Mandingo. However, this stereotype does have historical relevance. This stereotype was bolstered by the fact that entertainment, and in this case, sports entertainment, was one of the only arenas that black people were generally allowed to be visibly successful to the American populace professionally throughout most of the 20th century. Materialistic. Black people are often portrayed as materialistic. Now, there is a lot of complexity involved in the reality of this depiction. Historical systems of oppression and social segregation caused material displays of wealth to be one of the only ways in which black people could indicate class representation. There is also a trend of white record labels encouraging materialism in, for instance, rap lyrics. The Magic Negro. The Magic Negro is a black character that is designed to help guide a white protagonist in a story. They usually have unworldly or phenomenal insights, or in some cases, literal magic. Now, the types of representation that I've mentioned so far are stereotypes and are also historically racist. There are other stereotypes that I haven't mentioned, but generally they fall under one of the categories that I've already explained, and they don't show up much in current media, nor do we often see racist depictions of black people generally. When it comes to representation now, as the media pushes for more equal representation, I will discuss some types of black representation that aren't necessarily racist, but however are problematic in that same effort. Oftentimes, media presents this idea that blackness is monolithic, much like our voting bloc primarily is. However, diversity in the black community is rich, and the only thing that is even close to completely uniform in our community is our distaste for racism. Yet, in the following, we can see the primary ways in which the diversity of black people is represented poorly in the media. Black people are ethnically diverse. All black ancestry doesn't involve slaves in the United States, and some doesn't involve slavery at all. There are Caribbean black people, Central and South American black Latinos, Afro-Polynesians, and the number of various countries in Africa. Although most black Americans are ethnically Afro-American, there's no such thing as a generic black person in America because many of us come from a lot of different places in the world and within the country. As a Northerner, it is difficult to relate to some echelons of Southern black culture. I don't understand some of them, and many of them don't understand me. Some thinking that I'm rude at first glance, and as a Chicagoan, I get it. When I first moved to the South, I didn't understand some of what they were saying to me because they have a different dialect than I was used to hearing. And trust me, the South Side of Chicago has its own dialect. The point is, we're not the same. We don't always understand each other. There is colonial classism against Afro-Americans from some Africans on the basis of culture, just like it exists between some ethnicities of Asians and Spanish Europeans against Mexicans. Without forgoing the necessity of respect, some of these cultural differences are okay, but the point is, we're distinct, and film and media often forget this. For as diverse in subject matter is a show like Blackish, it is important to remember that the commentary they provide comes specifically from an Afro-American point of view, and often alienates the Caribbean Black or African experience in America, for example. The problem here is that the show suggests that Blackish encompasses the entirety of the Black purview, when it only addresses a small fraction of it. We also have classism in our community. There are wealthy Black families and poor Black families. They don't generally associate and often have different points of view. There is new fast money wealth in the Black community, and there's old my grandfather started a business money Black families. And with these different lifestyles and families, including the Black middle class, you have different types of belief systems, faith traditions, and politics. Some Black people are Republicans, and no, not just the Bible-thumping I hate my Blackness types, but fiscally conservative policy Republicans. We can use the show Girlfriends as a good example of these types of sociocultural distinction among Black people. They had all types of Black characters on the show. They had Black Republicans, hood types, bourgeois types, country types, Caribbean, and mixed, and they all had different jobs. They had fun, they went out, they went to therapy, they lived and loved, and they all had their own unique flavors of Blackness. The show was thoughtful to make commentary about the contrast that these different flavors produce within the broader Black community. They didn't just ignore them, or suggest that they're familiar to everyone within the community. Too often, media paints Blackness with a broad brush, as if there is a singular thought or viewpoint within the Black community. They often exclude depictions of other ethnicities of Blackness, in addition to depicting Afro-American Black people as one note, as if there aren't numerous subgroups in the Black community, with their own ways of thinking, speaking, and living. Malcolm X, in an interview, brought up an interesting fallacy of the media that persists to this day.
Today, you could point to a large number of Negro leaders who have consistently betrayed Negroes in a whole host of areas.
They aren't really Negro leaders. These are puppets that have been put in front of the Negro community by white liberals. Newsweek magazine, I think you said that this was the leaders who said that, who went with King and against Mr. Muhammad around 90%. I just told you a little while ago, these leaders that they call leaders, this included Lena Horne, this included Dick Gregory, and this included comedians, comics. Show me in the white community where a comedian is a white leader. Show me in the white community where a singer is a white leader, or a dancer or a trumpet player is a white leader. These aren't leaders. These are puppets and clowns that have been set up over the white community and over the Black community by the white community, and have been made celebrities and usually say exactly what they know that the white man wants to hear. You'll find that oftentimes Negroes are as much on guard.
When it comes to the Black experience, the media, namely the news media, will often elevate athletes, singers, and other entertainers to discuss Black issues instead of thought leaders, university professors, activists, and politicians. Entertainers are equipped to entertain well. They may have a heart for empowering the Black community, and historically, entertainers have always been the first voices white media has allowed to be seen or heard from within our community. However, especially now, these seats of authority on Blackness should be given to those who are intellectual authorities on these social subjects, who have devoted their lives and professions to that work. There's also something that I like to call the OREO Dilemma in pop media. Sometimes when Black people are represented in TV and movies, the purpose of their representation is to improve the diversity in the program. They'll be the best friend to the white kids. However, this type of representation becomes problematic, which generally is a fine type of representation, when that Black person acts too urban. If we're really thinking about the authenticity of these characters, a Black person who was raised primarily around white people, who only has white friends or white social circles, probably shouldn't be that urban. When they're communicating, they will probably use the same slang as their white friends, watch the same movies, dress the same way, listen to similar music as their peers. It becomes stereotypical when these Black characters behave stereotypically urban, when urban Black culture isn't inherent to Blackness. It is a culture of Black people in urban settings, like New York or Chicago. An OREO, as it were, is a real social reality. It has nothing to do with social awareness and understanding Black history, but more about how does this character identify? What does this character resonate with based upon their personality and environment? And if they're exclusively around white people, the answer should probably be mostly white things. The reason why Carlton was such a good foil for Will on The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air is because he represents a disparate identity of Blackness opposed to Will, one that is elite and wealthy rather than urban. The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air provides clever commentary about why Carlton's interests and identity don't undermine his Blackness.
Being Black isn't what I'm trying to be, it's what I am. I'm running the same race and jumping the same hurdles you are, so why are you tripping me up? You said we need to stick together, but you don't even know what that means. If you ask me, you're the real sellout.
And even how the experiences and perspectives of his parents' generation, who didn't grow up as wealthy, may differ from his. Along these same lines, there is a phenomenon that takes place when Black people are in stories that aren't written for Black people. This is when the Black person is a fish out of water in his own universe. If you have read a story or are watching a TV show that stars Black characters, ask yourself, how Black is the story actually? And no, I don't mean is the story about racism. I mean, what about the Black characters is Black? Are they being represented in their stories, or is it just that the character or story was written neutrally and they're essentially being used as a brown crayon to color the main character? The characters may not wear Black clothing, or have Black hairstyles, or use Black dialects. You may not see their Black families at all. They may not listen to Black music. So essentially, the only aspect of their Blackness that's represented in the program is their skin tone. This is an issue because when it comes to writing white characters in neutral or culturally non-specific narratives, this is fundamentally impossible. It will always be in some ways based in white culture. The clothing will be based in white culture. They'll speak languages or dialects in English. They'll live in white countries. The architecture will be European style. The family structure and the community structure will represent white American or European cultures. So essentially, although they may seem neutral, they are steeped in whiteness. Yet, when you put a Black character in the same circumstances, it becomes a Black character in a white story and they become a fish out of water. And although being a fish out of water isn't necessarily a bad thing at all times, it does alienate Blackness and Black narratives, which can communicate that brown skin is okay, but Black culture isn't. And finally, the last thing that is important to note is that Black culture isn't racism. Often in the media, when it comes to discussing Black stories or Black culture, it happens to be stories that are about or occur in response to racism. Racism isn't Black culture. Racism is something that all Black people deal with. And just because Afro-American people were in America the longest and have been the focal point of systematic racism, this doesn't make racism a part of our culture. Neither does it make the generational ennui of First Nation people's land being taken from them part of their culture. These things exist, but aren't part of our identity. Afro-American people are musical, having founded many genres of music. We have unique faith traditions. We have created all types of formal and communal dances. We have our own art. We've developed our own style of fashion, our own culinary traditions. And say what you want about it, we have created a number of regional dialects that generally fall under the umbrella of AAVE. Not to mention the dozens of other Black cultures that exist outside of the Afro-American tradition that exist in places like the West Indies, South America, and Africa, many of which exist outside of the daily ills of Western structural racism. So it is problematic when media outlets and the Oscars, for instance, award or celebrate Black stories that are solely about racism or slavery, even when the stories or programs are created by Black people. This can paint Blackness as one note, as being overly or wholly concerned with our proximity to or relationship with white society, which strips us of our diversity and, in a sense, an inherent social autonomy that assumes that we can make of our own culture what we will and our own existence what we will without the structural racism that has been a part of our history. There has been a more modern criticism of animation and film that has tended to anthropomorphize black characters. Princess and the Frog and others have been criticized for not allowing black characters to inhabit their own bodies for the majority of the film. Although the issue here is subjective in nature, this occurrence calls back to times in even recent history when black people were deemed unmarketable and therefore unworthy to appear as lead characters on shows and on covers of popular magazines. Often the promotional material for international releases of films that star black characters would remove these characters from adverts and trailers. Some Hollywood stories that should highlight black history marginalize blackness in their own films. Everything wrong with the black representation is quite a broad subject that cannot be distilled into what is and isn't racist. There, I'm sure, are other reasons why black representation could be wrongheaded, and black characters could be problematic, and the future will surely bring us more reasons to find fault, but generally any additional reason will fall under the categories previously mentioned. And although these things may be wrong, all representation is neither good or bad. Some stories may represent something real and positive and authentic about characters, while also falling into the pitfalls of unfortunate stereotypes. It is important that the media and creators of media use this knowledge not to point fingers, but to produce content that represents blackness of all forms and all peoples, both accurately and equitably.